Welcome to the Korea Now podcast. My name is Jed Lea-Henry, your host, and on today's show we're talking to award-winning journalist John Sweeney. So we're going to focus in today on two chapters in his book, North Korea Undercover. One on the IRA and one on the Romanian regime under Nicolae Ceausescu. Now I'm going to walk through this slowly because they are absolutely remarkable stories. North Korea today is a nation that is isolated by its own choice. It's called the Hermit Kingdom, but Korea in general has always been called the Hermit Kingdom. But they today are by definition the most isolated nation in the world. There is very few people out there still willing to call themselves allies with North Korea. There are still the odd smattering of countries around the world, but barely any left. They have lost their old pals in the Soviet Union. They have lost their old friends in China. There is basically no one else. But if we wind back to the Cold War, to those early days, there's something different. They have a few more friends, a few more allies, and two very strange ones along the way. One is the socialist wing of the Irish Republican Army, the Sticks. Now in each other, North Korea and the Sticks found kindred spirits. They both saw each other as small nations divided by harsh, dominating imperialist powers, cleaved in half, their whole countries torn in two. For North Korea, they found in the IRA a willing actor, someone who was willing to go out there into the world and make mayhem. Through terrorism and the chaos that would follow, they would find a way, if only small, to get back at the West, to damage the strength of what they saw as the imperialist nation, America. For the Irish, they saw a source of funds, money, and of course expertise, particularly in explosives. On the other side of Europe, North Korea had another friend, a single person, Nicolae Ceausescu, though he was also the dictator of communist Romania at the time. In North Korea, Ceausescu found a friend, an idea, something that he would model his own country on. He would change his nation from a reasoned-based form of communism, as far as that is possible, to a deeper, more paranoid, authoritarian, controlling state. And in each other, North Korea and Romania found the means to strip away some of the power that they felt was being held by the Soviet Union and China. They found a certain degree of independence and a degree of freedom. Through this podcast with John Sweeney, we're going to walk through both of these events, both of these remarkable stories. Though we'll have to give a very small disclaimer at the start here. Our internet connection was occasionally poor, so I've edited out a few tracks of audio, basically white noise. So at any point, if it sounds a little bit broken, a little bit stuttery, then this is why, and I apologize. So without any further ado, this is John Sweeney. John Sweeney, welcome to the Korea Now podcast.
Hello.
Hi. So we're going to walk through two chapters in your book, one about the IRA and one about Romania and their links with North Korea. So to go to the IRA first, let's take us back to 1969, when the group splits into two distinct organizations, the Provost on one side and the Sticks on the other side.
Yeah, the Stickies. So what happens is that the wholly understandable civil unrest in Northern Ireland, because the Catholics feel with good reason that they've been oppressed by the Protestant majority in Northern Ireland. These peaceful protests run into trouble very quickly, and the two communities develop forces of violence. On the Catholic nationalist side, you've got the IRA, which historically has been kind of one block, the Irish Republican Army, and it splits into two. It's an ideological split. Much more nationalist and eventually more violent is the Provisional IRA, and they are up for a full-on attack on the British state as they see it, and also on effectively, in the eyes of many, this is also a war on the Protestant majority, whoever they are. The other side of the split is a much smaller group called the Official IRA. Their nickname is the Stickies, and they cleave to a purer ideological line close to that of the Irish Workers' Party, which is effectively the Irish Communist Party. Now, both wings of the IRA want a united Ireland. They want the British to get out of Ireland, but the official IRA becomes, after a while, a thorn in the side of the provisional IRA. It's a strange tension and some degree of animosity and a little bit of fighting between the two groups. What happens down the track is, when looking for money and looking for internationalist help, the stickies, the official IRA, end up crazily and weirdly in bed with the North Korean regime.
Okay, so we'll come to that right now, actually. So the leader of the stickies is a man called Sean Garland, and he's going to run through a lot of what we're going to speak about now. But first off, it begins with a man called Len that you met in a bar in Belfast, I believe, who went to North Korea in October 1988.
Yes. I don't know whether your listeners know, but I did a documentary in 2007 called Scientology and Me. And in that documentary, I was, the purpose of this story comes apparent shortly.
Sure.
I lost my temper with a leading Scientologist, a man called Tommy Davis, and they spied on us and I lied about us and they followed us around. They played mind games. There were car chases in LA and all of this.
Very typical behavior for the Scientologists, right?
It's all on YouTube, Scientology and Me. I've written a book about it, Church of Fear. Anyway, so I am well known in Britain and in Ireland for my intense dislike of the Church of Scientology. They say I'm a liar and a bigot, etc. I met this man. Now, I have an Irish surname and I drink Irish whiskey, but I'm English and I work for the BBC, and there is always a bit of tension if you meet somebody who's been in the IRA. There's Len, two others, and as we meet, Len says, John, before we start, I have one thing to tell you. And I said, what's that? I was a bit nervous. There were three of them, and they were bigger than me. And they said, John, I'm a member of the Church of Scientology. And I went, sod you. It was a joke. He was winding me up.
I think in the book you said, fuck you, I think, yes.
Did I say fuck you? So I'm a BBC reporter. These are not the views of the BBC. You're trained not to say fuck on
yes,
there.
Yes.
I said, fuck you.
Yes.
And we all laughed. He was winding me up. But there was a strange truth behind the gag, because he went to North Korea to learn how to kill the British in '88. He went to a terrorist camp. And he realized very quickly that life for ordinary North Koreans was miserable, and that they were being brainwashed, and had been massively brainwashed, to believe that no country like no other, that this North Korea was some kind of paradise. And he could see this in the food, the way people were treated, the way they were clothed, how they lived their lives. This was a horrible lie. And he realized that they'd been brainwashed, and also in some way he'd been brainwashed by the IRA. And going to North Korea was the moment his divorce began from violent Irish Republican nationalism. And I find his story and how you unlock brainwashing, I found it completely fascinating. And I've developed a thriller series, and I've called Len Joe Tip Lady. Len, by the way, isn't his real name.
Of course, yes.
But I've called I developed a thriller series based on this man. It's called Cold, and the second one's Road, and it's about how somebody who was in the IRA, who saw the truth of North Korea for himself, and realized, my God, these people are brainwashed.
And on that topic, there is a chapter in your book actually on brainwashing as well. But so these men, they fly to Moscow and then they fly through to North Korea. And when they get there, you're saying that they were doing training to kill the British. and it's this ramble of taekwondo and assault weapons and all sorts of booby traps. But they're not the only people at the base. There's also Palestinians and the Tanzanian Air Force. And at one point you mention in your book that along with groups like this and Hezbollah and the Tamil Tigers, you believe a lot of what North Korea were doing here was trying to make trouble for the West.
Yes. By the way, when they flew, I think they flew, there was a North Korean embassy at that time in Denmark, and they did the organization. And there'd been a couple of fraternal visits, as it were, to Denmark. Garland had organized them, and that was going on. And I think they flew London, sort of Belfast, London, Denmark, Moscow. At which point, when they got to Moscow, they surrendered their passports. And then they were flown to Pyongyang. And their passports weren't stamped. So this was an entirely kind of invisible trip to North Korea. When they got there, they ended up in a terrorist camp, obviously some kind of army base, guarded by thin strands of barbed wire, I think from memory. But remember, if you're a Westerner, you're a European, you stand there like a mile in North Korea. So actually, they wouldn't have had to have much security because you'd be picked up very, very quickly. And they lived miserable lives in barracks. The food was disgusting.
Yes, at one point you say that, or Len says that he was given dog soup.
It was, they were given dog soup and they were given chicken. And Len suspected the chicken wasn't chicken. And one day there was a field of crows settled down on the ground. And Len said the word, the Korean word for chicken, and pointed at the crows. And one of the Korean guards, or instructors who was more friendly than the others, nodded, and that was his answer. They weren't eating chicken; they were eating crow.
So at one point, as they're eating chicken and crow and dog, the Irishmen begin to cotton on that if they make up holidays, they'll get better food and more alcohol. So they create this holy feast of Halloween.
Yeah, they were very quickly. They hated it. There was something else going on, but the reality was the Irish, the official IRA, was a small group of men in West Belfast who, with their connections or whatever, were looking at maybe 500, maybe 1,000 people, if that. The provisional IRA was much, much bigger. Obviously, that's gone on. Their political wing was Sinn Féin. So the PIRA was much, much smaller. And part of this was essentially Sean Garland had oversold to the North Koreans how strong they were. And the North Koreans presumed that they had kind of tanks and guerrilla bases up in the mountains of Northern Ireland. Nothing like that existed at all. So part of the weirdness for these soldiers, for these ordinary official IRA soldiers, was that they knew they were into a lie. They weren't that militarily that strong. And they realized that the North Koreans were horribly ignorant about the truth, which is not to say, for example, that there weren't awful things happening on both sides and the British state wasn't doing bad things too. All of that's true. But North Korean ignorance meant that this terrorist course was silly, and they were hungry, and they got bored very, very quickly with it. They got bored with the regimen, with the harshness of it all, and so they started taking the mickey. Halloween, they said it was a great big feast, kind of like Christmas, and it meant the North Koreans, who like a drink, by the way. When I was there was an excellent Austrian brewery. Whether the brewery lost money or not, I don't know, but it made really good beer in North Korea. And North Korea is a drinking, or South Korea too, it's a drinking country. Anyway, they all got drunk, and then the fighting started.
Yes, yes. So just before we get to that here, there is this one point. So Garland oversold his hand and got a few armaments from the North Koreans as help. But Len says at one point what they were really after from the North Koreans was help with explosives and training. And of course, he does say at one point that what they were taught was, I quote, too bloody complicated. But they were really trying to learn explosive techniques, weren't they?
Yes, they were learning. They had two things: bombs, and remember that they were careful. They made a horrible mistake in '71. The official IRA, they'd blown up the parachute headquarters, the British parachute battalion headquarters in Aldershot in Hampshire. They'd killed 6 cleaners and the Roman Catholic padre, and this was a horrible, stupid thing to do. And the official IRA lost an enormous amount of credibility and respect, and they learnt their lesson. And from then on, they were much, much more careful about causing loss to human life in Britain and in Northern Ireland than the provisionals. So they became much more cautious, and also, but they never forgot the ideological dimension of the war. There were times when the IRA, the provisional IRA, you could almost call it a death squad, in that they were out to kill Protestants and the security services. For example, there's one celebrated attack. There's a wonderful book about the IRA by a guy called Kevin Poulis called Rebel Hearts, and he documents how the IRA try and kill a member of the British security state who's actually a dog warden for the animal rescue thing that works in Northern Ireland. So anyway, the official IRA are more worried about the loss of human life. They're interested in explosives so that they can make bomb threats. What they try and do is put in phone calls so nobody actually gets killed, but they're interested in explosives and they're interested in the handgun. So that there's a disconnect between the two objectives. The official IRA, the stickies, they want to know how to use bombs, how to use explosives, detonators, etc., etc., and they want handguns so they can do small-scale robberies to fund their efforts. The North Koreans are teaching them how to wage a full-scale civil war, the kind of thing that you might have seen in Lebanon in the 1780s. And again, this is because the North Koreans are ignorant of what's really happening in Northern Ireland and ignorant of the world. And there isn't, because of the system, the top down says you teach the Irish comrades to do X and Y, but the Irish comrades said, well, we don't want this, we want Z. So there's a disconnect, which also leads to a growing sense of unease and a kind of this is a bit rubbish, frankly. That's how it netted out.
Sure. And as it all comes to an end, you mentioned there that Len says it was the worst place he had ever been to, and through all the cold, the hunger, and the boredom, it all ends after a punch-up, and the North Koreans effectively dress them down, and the Irishmen decide to leave. But they do leave a present for the great leader, a piece of stolen property.
They gave Kim Il-sung, the great leader, this hammock, which looks as though it might be made of straw, but actually it's ceramic. Now, of course, so I asked them, so where did you get this? And we didn't buy it in a shop. They burgled a big museum somewhere, I think, in the Irish Republic, and then presented this piece of stolen goods to the office of Kim Il-sung. They didn't meet him, and I can understand why, because they were always, their presence there was low key. Anyway, they got kicked out. The fight, the two Irishmen, there's another guy, and Len, and they're falling out. And at one point, Len's a big man. The smaller Irishman, I think, who might be quite an aggressive fellow, they square up to each other. Len hits him, and the fight is over as far as Len is concerned. Later that evening, the other guy lies in wait for him in the dark. And remember, they've been training man-to-man combat stuff, so that they start applying their lessons. And the little guy, or the smaller guy, goes for Len in the dark, and Len has to fight for his life. And he almost kills the other guy. He doesn't kill the other guy, but he hurts him badly, because he's fighting for his life in his view as the fight happens. And Len is thrown out of North Korea fighting, and I'm shaking the hand of a man who's been thrown out of North Korea.
Yes. So 1 year later, 1989 now, and you met another man briefly who went there in 1989, Liam. Now, he's a devout Marxist, member of the Irish Workers' Party as well, and he travels a very similar trip a year later, but he goes with Garland, and they stop off on the way in Berlin and also in Moscow. And in Moscow, he meets a young lady called Elena, who is quite dismissive of his Marxism. She takes him into a supermarket and says, and I quote, "You have no idea what it's like. We can't breathe," as she looks around at the society around her.
Yes. I mean, again, what's fascinating about this is that we're dealing here with Irish Marxists who are who believe that the British state is a force of violence and oppressive and imperialist, and they have never really, they might have gone to Spain or whatever, but they've never left the world. Ideology is so pure. They get to Moscow, this woman Elena saying this system is shit, and also look at the lack of food. That actually, however miserable or difficult life could be for a Catholic nationalist Irishman in West Belfast in Northern Ireland, it was nothing like as miserable as the lot of ordinary North Koreans. For Liam, the moment of ideological doubt hit him not in North Korea, it hit him over the head in Moscow. And the truth is that he fell a little bit in love with this woman, Elena. Obviously, she was attractive, but she was also sparky and feisty. And she was saying, listen, you clots, you don't know what you're talking about. You're like, we don't have enough to eat. There's nothing in the shops. Our system's rubbish. And you're just, what you're talking about, your ideology is rubbish. And this before, this is 89. So I think it's early 89, before the fall of the Berlin Wall, before the Romanian Revolution.
Yes.
Where there is still this legacy. Now, part of this is a kind of strange. It's almost like a sort of time machine stuff. Is that communists, and in particular Irish communists, were so rooted in the struggle against the British state, against British imperialism as they saw it. They were blind to the wider realities of the world, that actually that what was happening in Northern Ireland was way more complicated than that, and actually their own lives were physically way less hard than this, than life in Russia. And bang, you get to North Korea. Liam was a kind of aide to Garland. Garland, by the way, is an intensely charismatic man. My knowledge of politics, my knowledge of history makes me fear anyone who's charismatic. I've become afraid of them because of their abilities to effectively brainwash people. And Garland's Irish Republican movement, the officials, towards the end, it felt like a cult where you did what the masters said, and if you crossed him, you feared for your life. And so Liam went along with the whole thing and went along with the charade and went along with the meetings with the North Koreans and nodded and said, we're grateful for your contribution to the struggle. But a part of him knew from this conversation with Eleanor, this woman he pretty much fell in love with in Russia, that it was all a stinking lie.
Yes. There is one point though. So after he gets to Pyongyang, and this might be a bit more of a personal question for you, Liam says that, of course, this is 1989, and it's just after the Seoul Olympics, and Pyongyang are trying to compete and make their city quite pretty and upstanding. But he says he found it quite impressive, quite upstanding. Large streets and impressive buildings. What did you think of Pyongyang when you were there? Did you find it the same way?
No. Streets are wide. There is a big motorway, for example, which runs pretty much across the western from Pyongyang to the Western Sea. It's extraordinarily wide. It's 10 lanes wide at some points. The surface is comically uneven, and at speed in our tourist bus, one almost felt seasick because the road undulates, because it hasn't been made properly. So it looks magnificent, but in reality, it's a bit rubbish. Secondly, there's no traffic on it, so it doesn't need to be this wide. It's a piece of grandiose swagger. But if they built a two-lane highway, or even just two single-track roads properly, it would have been much better and much less sick-making. In our hotel in Pyongyang, which was something like a 4-star hotel, the door didn't fit the frame. So this is the door into the hotel room. It didn't fit the frame. There were power cuts every day we were there. It was March. It was freezing. I wore a vest, a shirt, a jumper, a jacket, and a heavy coat and a hat the whole time. Much of the time indoors too, because it was so cold. I'm overweight, a bit chubby. I don't get cold that often. I was cold the whole time I was there. There was a pool of water in the main toilet, on the men's toilet on the ground floor. I'm not talking about like an indoor swimming pool of water in the toilet. The food, you could tell from the way the waiters and waitresses gave you the food that they were offering you some kind of banquet, and the food was paltry and weird and unpleasant.
And on that point there, Liam says that what really alarmed him was the absolute subservience of the wait staff, actually, at one point.
Yes. No, I found it. I'm a huge fan of Basil Fawlty. Waiters and waitresses they don't have to be fantastically rude to you as Basil Fawlty is, but they show some independence of mind. And every now and then, if a hotel guest is being silly or ridiculous, they can stand up for themselves. The converse is, I don't like it at all as a human being when people are too subservient. And it was clear in North Korea that people were terrified of in any way doing anything which might cause us displeasure. The tension, and this in particular with the guides, who, let's remember, people like human rights organizations say the guides are in fact secret police agents, or they have to report to the secret police. The tension is that when we wanted to do something, and they said, no, you can't do that. So they wanted to please you, and would please you as much as they can within the limits of this crazy mindset. And after the first couple of days, when you're there, you're scared, you don't want to put a foot wrong, something might happen to you. When you realize that there are limits to what they can do to you, and that they are in a funny way afraid of you, afraid of they treat Westerners are treated as honoured guests in society. it became more of a tussle. Anyway, I felt I was inside a slave state, and the roads were big. They were badly made. If you drove faster than them, you felt seasick. The puddle in the toilet, the lights go out all the time. The only place where the heat and light was consistent was the mausoleum to God the Father and God the Son. What kind of society like that is? This is a political religion. It's not an ordinary society. And I feel people who say, it's actually much better than it looks. It's a sick society.
Yes. At one point, there is an ideology of sorts, though it's a bit of a veneer. And at one point, there is some attempt to have some sort of cross-ideological work done. So in 1986, Sinn Féin sends a message which says, "We offer our support to the Workers' Party of Korea to fight in it for its establishment of the Democratic Federated Republic of Korea." And in 1987, Sinn Féin's President Gerry Adams attends the 75th birthday of Kim Il-sung at the Danish embassy. And then Jerry McLaughlin writes this article after he comes out of prison called "The Irish Republican and Juche Conception of National Self-Dignity Are One." So I might get you to touch on Juche and your thoughts on that. You're the Irishman Len, if you go back to him for a second. He says this, and I need an Irish accent and I can't do it. He says, "That was an absolute load of fuck."
It was... Len's exactly right. Jucheism is an absolute load of fuck. In Len's accent, I was an absolute load of fuck. Brian Myers is a great expert on this, and he's written a number of books about North Korean ideology. But the starting point is 45. The Russians take the northern end of the Korean peninsula. The Americans end up with the southern end. You've got Marxism-Leninism as interpreted by Joseph Stalin, and Myers says, I think entirely rightly, but Stalinism as it played out across Russia and the Soviet Empire was essentially, in reality, a far-right nationalism of blood and ethnic purity, disguised by an icing of equality and communism. But the bedrock is much more far-right, nationalistic, ethnic purity. And the North Koreans bought this. And so there is an awful lot of stuff about the ethnic purity of the North Koreans. It's probably the most ethnically pure state on earth because there has been so little immigration or emigration from that state. And I often think when I'm thinking about people like Nigel Farage in Britain, or perhaps Donald Trump in the United States, Wilders in the Netherlands, but these particular people who sort of who warn against the mixing up of our societies, and I understand that many of their supporters are worried about this, and these are fair enough concerns. The counter argument is, if you really want an ethnically pure state, you go live in North Korea and see how you like it. But what happens then over time is that communism becomes the dream that dies, and by the late 80s, it's in trouble. Now, the regime is still banging the drum of Marxism-Leninism as interpreted by the founding fathers of communism, with additional help by Kim Il-sung. And then more and more, Kim Il-sungism comes to the fore, and Jucheism is invented along the track. Jucheism is gibberish, which has been dressed up as a pure North Korean ideology, and it doesn't really have any intellectual base. It's mumbo jumbo, but essentially the ideas are: you've got to love the Kim dynasty, you've got to love Kim Il-sung, you've got it's a political religion. You will obey Kim Il-sung. He's the founding father, and do everything you should to obey the party, which is the main organ. Blah 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 blah. So Judaism is it's a make-believe construct, and what happens over time is that it slowly the Marxism is dialed down and dialed down. In 2012. There was people I know went to North Korea, and there was still a picture of Marx and Engels on the main revolution square, the big square in Pyongyang. 2013, when we were there, those signs had gone. So what you're left with is Marxism, Leninism, without the Marx and without the Lenin, and then the ism, and then you front end it, and then it becomes Kim Il-sungism, and they dress that up as a slightly stronger ideology called Judaism. So really what happened was that, and this was a commonality across the Soviet bloc, the communist states would fund useful idiots, and they would pay them a little bit of money to write rubbishy things. And so this Irishman who wrote the IRA freedom struggle and Judaism are as one, that's total bollocks.
Would you include that organization that you went to North Korea with, the Friends of North Korea, I believe it was?
It's called the Korean Friendship Association.
Sorry, yeah.
They don't like me, etc., etc. But I would say the KFA is it's Scientology for North Korean junkies.
Okay.
It's run by this weird Spanish guy whose name currently escapes me, but the weird Spanish guy, and it's a super loyal organization. We went. There is a problem if you're a journalist like me with a reputation. It's very easy to Google me. So when you apply on your visa application, you get Googled, and then they don't let you in. We worked out that the Korean Friendship Association was so weird that so long as you said, we're very committed and excited about the North Korean idea, then they didn't bother Google you. Also, they charge slightly over the odds because I think they need money. So there's a question here about the integrity of the people who believe in North Korea as a beautiful dream. Some people do, and I believe in a free society, and good luck to them. All I can tell you is that the evidence of my own eyes and the evidence of in particular, North Korean defectors who've had the courage to get out, most of whom live in South Korea. Weirdly, some live near where I used to live in South London, in Malden, New Malden. There's a small British South Korean community, and within that there's an even smaller North Korean British community. All of these people say Korea is an evil state. We've all read the great books, The Aquariums of Pyongyang, etc., etc. These ideologues are pathetic remnants of a dead ideology banging a drum, and they're kind of like mosquitoes in that they're irritants. The problem is, I think that, for example, they have the power, or they have the capacity to distort the conversation about something like that, like North Korea, because they massively fail to understand the true nature of this state. They lack common sense. Some of them, one has to ask questions. They'll deny this, obviously, and say that I'm a fascist propagandist or whatever. But I would say that there is a degree of corruption in some of these organizations in how they relate to North Korea. They have officially approved rights of access. They can run trips into North Korea, and that means that they have to accommodate with the regime. Now, of course, they're happy to do so ideologically. One wonders what's the financial basis of this relationship. And so, I mean,
so they're effectively employees of the North Korean state almost, right?
Contractors,
okay.
Contractors, but another word for contractors is mercenaries.
Sure.
And
yes.
And that's not great. I mean, I covered the Romanian Revolution, and you had the same thing. People before Ceausescu fell saying that Westerners saying how wonderful he was. One of the most revolting examples of this kind of horrible, cynical, commercially driven sycophancy was Robert Maxwell, who wrote a series of books praising the political skills of somebody like Nicolae Ceausescu, and no mention of the secret police, no mention at all.
So we'll come on to Romania in just a second. So just to finish off the part on the IRA and come back to Garland. When Liam was there with him, Liam sat at home and went on tours while Garland went and met the upper echelons by himself. And for Garland, it was all about money, it seemed. He'd been to North Korea 6 times at the time, and he was after, at least in part, super dollars. What are super dollars?
The super dollar is a North Korean counterfeit $100 note, made beautifully well on, I believe, old East German printing presses. The Americans have got a problem. The pound note, the euro, for example, not the pound note, the £20 note, the euro notes are really complicated pieces of printing. The American public doesn't like changing dollar notes, and therefore, of all the big currencies in the world, the dollar is the easiest to counterfeit. The North Koreans spotted the weakness and went for it, and they printed hundreds of thousands of super dollars. Fantastic way for a dark state like North Korea to make money. The problem is they need people to convert the super dollar, the $100 fake notes, back into real dollars and send the real dollars back to North Korea. And Garland's official IRA became the main, I believe, mechanism to do this. So what happened was, and Len did this, and Len and his circle did this, is that they would give super dollars to Northern Irish Republican official IRA sympathizing pensioners who would go on a trip, would go into a bureau exchange, and 200, 300, 400 of these, 4 or 5 notes of super dollars, and then they'd get money back. It would then be pesetas, which they then, when they got back to Ireland, some of it they'd keep for themselves, but most of it they would return in pounds. And one day, I believe, Len processed, in one day, he processed £40,000, which he would stack up the £40,000, and then that would go back, I believe, via the North Korean embassy in Denmark, which was the main hub for all of this activity, back to North Korea. So 40,000 quid in a night is a ton of money. So what was towards the end, the official IRA ceased to be, in any meaningful sense, a paramilitary group with its own genuine political cause or identity or function. It became a criminal entity, a gang, which had a crazy, geopolitically, a crazy bedfellow, the North Korean state. And the North Koreans were using the official IRA and their soldiers and their families to wash these counterfeit notes. What's fascinating is that North Korea is in reality a criminal gang which controls a nation state. So that the true ideology of North Korea and also the official IRA is much more like a criminal gang, a mafia organization than anything else. And the two of them scratched each other's backs. It's one of the most amazing stories that I've ever come across in my entire life.
You do mention here at the very end, it's worth mentioning, that counterfeiting another country's currency, it may feel like a minor act, but in fact, in terms of international law, it's an act of economic war.
Yes. North Korea waged economic war against the United States. And certainly in terms of counterfeiting the $100 bill, North Korea got the better of the United States. It's quite... Not enough people know about what happened, and it's extraordinary. My colleague Declan Lawn did a panorama, a BBC Panorama program about it, and I believe it might be on YouTube somewhere. And I write about it in my book. It's an extraordinary story of how the North Korean state, in this regard, got the better of the United States of America, the most powerful nation on earth.
Okay, John Sweeney. So we'll move on now to Romania as well. Now, this is an interesting story. Now, it won't be as long as the IRA part before, but this is fascinating because when it all came down for Nicolae Ceausescu, you were there. So on Christmas Day, Christmas night, he makes this final rambling speech. He's dragged away and executed. And the next morning, you walk through the old ruins of the old committee building and you stumble upon a picture of Ceausescu and a man in a Mao suit, which you take home. And that man is Kim Il-sung. So what is this relationship between Ceausescu and Kim Il-sung?
So it's a completely fascinating story. What happened was that inside the Soviet bloc, various countries made alliances with each other, and there was some ideology in there as well. And essentially, North Korea was tilting more towards Stalinism than it was the most Stalinist. The exception I'm thinking about is Albania, but North Korea was probably the most Stalinist state in reality inside the entire communist bloc. Now Ceausescu became a kind of pop idol of the West when he stood up against the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. He didn't like the Russians invading Czechoslovakia for nationalist reasons, but in reality, this gesture by Ceausescu was very deceiving, because his lesson from the Prague Spring was don't do that. One should become more communist, effectively more Stalinist than anyone else, and then that would inoculate you against the this adventure of the Prague Spring, and therefore the Russians need not invade. So what happened was that Ceausescu marched to a more Stalinist position, and therefore the Romanians and the North Koreans became more and more friendly. The man who explained this to me best of all is a wonderful old man. I think he may have passed away. He was very old when I met him in 2013. Called Isidor Urian, and he was a very clever young Romanian guy with a gift for languages. And in 1954, he went from Bucharest to Pyongyang. He went by train. It took him 14 days. When he got there, North Korea had been flattened by American bombs. The Americans dropped more bombs on North Korea during the Korean Civil War than they did on Nazi Germany throughout all of the Second World War. There was hardly one solid building left. He lived in rubble. It was incredibly cold. Life was unbearably hard. but he mastered Korean, and eventually the great defining moment of his life came in 1972. This is all on YouTube. There are pictures of it, when Ceausescu comes to North Korea and visits Pyongyang, and there is this extraordinary footage on YouTube of the two leaders in what looks like a Cadillac, open top, driving through the streets of Pyongyang with hundreds of thousands of North Koreans serenading and applauding, dancing in beautiful synchronicity. This is a political religion idolizing two gods.
So that's a strange point, though, isn't it? Because at least today, there must have been a dramatic shift, because this sort of shared adulation between the North Korean leader and an outside leader now would run against all their ideas of an extreme nationalism.
Yes. So, but Kim Il-sung was a communist, was a Marxist-Leninist, as Ceausescu was. So at this time, in the 70s, they still believed in the old religion. Both of them did. And so it's only in the 80s and 90s, as communism, Marxism, Leninism dies a death, that it's replaced by an ultra-nationalistic Kim Il-sungism, Jucheism, what have you. So at this point in 72, at this knife slash in time, we're talking, they are fellow believers in an ideology of Marxism, Leninism. But if you look at the pictures of it, it looks like a political religion where adulation of power, of the men in power, is the thing. By the way, in the back of the Cadillac, there is a little man in a cheap black suit, and he's also there when the two gods take the applause of everybody, and he's the translator, Isidore Urian.
Yes.
Because the two guys have got to talk to each other. There's some crazy stuff, by the way. There's a biplane that sort of leaves smoke flying low over the mass crowds. Then the crowds, they show paper cards which can, if they flash them, you can see the picture change. So you're looking at maybe 100,000 people using paper cards in front of their faces to show slogans, glory to Romania, glory to the Socialist Republic of Romania, glory to North Korea and Kim Il-sungism, etc., etc. So if you're fascinated by the mechanics of totalitarianism, this is it. This is the purest expression I've ever seen of the totalitarian mindset.
And for people listening, there is a link to that in your book as well.
Yes. So physically, you can see it, and it's it's both sickening and amazing, both at the same time. But Isidore. Well, now the other point about Kim Il-sung is that he travelled the world far more than Kim Jong-il, and far more than Kim Jong-un. He went in a train, which is, there's a James Bond movie where the baddie has his own train, as Stalin had his own train, and literally Kim Il-sung had his own train, and he went to Romania in it in the 70s. And people say about Kim Il-sung that he was a mass murderer. He invaded South Korea and started a war which cost 3 million lives to no purposeful effect, because at the end of the war the two states were exactly where they'd started. He supervised a reign of terror in which all political opponents were murdered. He created the Gulag, in which hundreds of thousands of people were perished. He was an evil mass murderer, no question. Isidore met him and said he could be gracious. So, for example, there is a story the North Koreans say that one day he's driving along in his car, and there's a poor woman who's struggling in the rain, and he stops and gives her a lift. And Isidore says something like, "This story may not be untrue," i.e., it's possible it was true. When he was working flat out as a translator, Ceausescu, who was an impatient, bad-tempered man, and also stupid, and then more stupid too, didn't understand how exhausting it is to translate. And the other problem is, at the end of the day, Isidore would have to write notes and have to translate what he'd written while they were sleeping, so that there was a log of all the communication, which meant that after a couple of days, Isidore fainted, because he didn't have enough sleep and had not enough time to eat or drink, and he was just shattered. And the Ceausescus were kind of angry with him. Kim Il-sung was quite gracious with him. When Kim Il-sung visited Bucharest, on the way back, Isidore went with Kim Il-sung. He was spending time in Romania, but they went from Bucharest to the end of the Romanian border, at which point Isidore said goodbye and returned to Bucharest. That journey, there was a magnificent breakfast. Kim Il-sung left the car he was in and went to find Isidore and said, "Would like to join me for breakfast?" Picked his brains, talked about stuff. But nevertheless, there's Isidore is a good witness. He ended up seeing the fall of communism and ended up very happy that communism had fell. He knew that people disappeared in North Korea. He knew that it was a dark, dark place here. There was some humanity about Kim Il-sung. You don't hear this. You hear from people I met, people who've met Kim Jong-il. He was a creepy, sly weirdo. I've never heard somebody tell these kind of stories about him, and the same goes for Kim Jong-un. He's a kind of
you mentioned Brian Myers earlier, and one of the things that Myers says in his book is North Korea paint an image of Kim Il-sung as this man, this parent leader who goes around to army bases and worries about whether the soldiers are being fed enough or whether they're warm enough. And Isidore says there's at least some truth in that. And at one point you say the older generation in North Korea is happy to give all the benefit of the doubt to the older man, but the two younger sons less so.
Yes, I mean, how bad things are. So when I go to Romania these days, I talk to ordinary Romanians in London. They say, "Oh, things were better under Ceausescu." And I went to Ceausescu's Romania in 1985 as a young journalist, and it was shit. It was dreadful. Mm-hmm. It was like walking inside somebody else's migraine. There was no food in the shops. Nobody would dare talk to you because they'd have to report the conversation with a foreigner to the Securitate. It felt awful and miserable. And these young people and their grandparents and grandparents now tell me, "Oh, life was better." And has to be aware of how the memory of horror, memory of dullness fades, and when you're young, life is good. That's a problem. But nevertheless, Isidore is a witness. I also think that he appreciated that Kim Il-sung was a kinder, or at least a more gracious human being than Nicolae Ceausescu. Isidore is witness to that. Ceausescu was so solipsistic, he didn't get it that a translator, and Kim Il-sung did. So in that regard, in that very, very limited regard, Kim Il-sung was a better man. Kim Il-sung actions led to the unnecessary death, the murder. I'll overstate it. The truth was Kim Il-sung was a mass murderer.
You mentioned from 1954 to 1983 that Isidore goes to North Korea on 50-odd occasions. And he sees a huge change in the country at this time. He says more people are going missing and end up in gulags, and there's less freedom on foreign travelers like himself.
Yes, the state, as the logic for the state dies, as Marxism-Leninism, it becomes obvious that it's failing and not working, then North Korea had two choices, or rather, Kim Il-sung had two choices, because there is only one political actor in North Korea, and his name is Kim Il-sung. What happened was he had either to say, right, we're wrong, that's the end, we're now going to embrace democracy, free market, the rule of law, or we carry on with our own path, and if people don't like it, then I'm going to lock them up and shoot them. And so as Marxism-Leninism died across the world, as the ideology faltered, it became more extreme, and then they added this Jucheism, Kim Il-sungism on top of that, and the unarticulated component and the real decider was fear, the rule of fear rather than the rule of law. So that and to make that work, you had to lock more and more people up, you had to shoot more and more people, you had to get the message that if you fell out of favor, if you were seen to be a potential traitor, not just you would end up shot, but your children and your grandchildren would go to the gulag. And this creates, and has created, and this state of affairs remains, that North Korea, there is installed in every North Korean a dread. The phrase is, you don't do this, oh, he's gone to the mountains. He's gone to the mountains. I mean, he's off to the gulag. Everybody knows what that means. So one of the problems I've got with people like the Korean Friendship Association, or even some kind of perfectly innocent Western tourists who go to North Korea, is that they say, well, it looked pretty nice to me, and the hotels looked okay, and the roads are big. Yeah, but what about the gulag?
Yeah,
you can't, like nobody goes there. You can only film it from space or from a distance. The reason is simple: is because you die, and everybody with you will go to the gulag, and all your fixers and minders or whatever you will endanger their lives if you try and do that. So the change over time is fear becomes greater and greater. The other thing that perhaps is true is that Isidore began to understand Korea better and better, and over time had a wider circle of friends and acquaintances, and therefore became a shrewder observer. It's possible that there was violence in the police state from the get-go. It's just he understood the evidence of stuff he was seeing with his own eyes, which none of this is articulated, because to say it is to touch a live wire. To say it is to die.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
So that's another factor. I'm sceptical that it was good before, but what's certainly true is the ideology started to collapse, and therefore you've got to reign in terror. Terror became the answer.
So I'll just get you to finish off on Romania with 1971. And many Romanians see this as this break in time where Ceausescu seemed to have learned a few lessons from, or at least seen some things he liked in North Korea and brought them back home. And he sort of changed a still quite poor, quite bad Romanian communism into something much more regimented, much more controlled.
Yes, there's a guy called Chelak who was a Romanian diplomat and translator, English, Romanian, Romanian, English. And he said, up until 1971, it was all silly, it was all wrong, it was all rubbish, it was Soviet, but there was some humanity, and Ceausescu had within the confines of his ideology was open to ideas and open to change. Then he went to Pyongyang and Beijing, but Pyongyang was the big big one in Chechny's view. And when he returned from North Korea, he went mad. He became in love with the idea of the North Korean vision of this political religion, and he wanted to turn Romania into North Korea. And that was when Romania started marching, and it became more and more of a Stalinist totalitarian society. So while the rest of Eastern Europe opened up, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia sort of slouched away from Marxism-Leninism, Romania went crazily off into the North Korean direction. And as a result, Romania, which is inherently a rich country with a massive potential, became more crazy than you can possibly imagine. And this crazy, strange, one of the most amazing moments of my entire life as a reporter is crossing Romania on the 24th of December 1989 as the revolution's happening, and then getting to the Communist Party headquarters, and there are sort of spent bullets under feet. There's crazy Romanian soldiers still firing rounds into the air, and then finding a book. I think the next day, Christmas Day, and it's an enormous book called Homage, and then in it there is Ceausescu and the guy in the mouse suit, and the guy in the mouse suit, that's Kim Il-sung. And I thought, who the hell is he? Ended up in North Korea, bowing in the mausoleum to Kim Il-sung, as you have to do. And as I bowed, I thought, by the way, I said to myself, I don't believe in this. I'm play acting. You're a bad man.
So that leads us into a good final question to get you to open this up. So Ceausescu's regime came down as a lot of communist regimes came down. Sort of overnight, it just crumbled around us and no one saw it coming. But coming soon, of course, Donald Trump is going to be, at least in principle, meeting with Kim Jong-un. So what do you make of that whole process? Will it happen? How will it work out? And is this the way to bring about change in North Korea, or is there some other strategy that you believe is best?
I think there are three important players here: Kim Jong-un, Donald Trump, and Stormy Daniels. And my worry is that this is a piece of political theatre where there is no middle-term or long-term benefit for the West, but it does blind the world to the allegations made by the former porn star that she had sex with Donald Trump and that Donald Trump's lawyer paid her off. I'm a follower of Diogenes the Cynic. What we've got is that it's a great piece of political theatre, but the reality is, that Trump's threats to the Rocket Man, will fire and fury. That's nonsense. Pyongyang and Seoul are really quite close to each other. Seoul is something like 35 miles away from the DMZ. If America struck North Korea in any way, North Korea can fire chemical weapons in shells, in simple artillery, to Seoul and kill maybe 500,000 South Koreans. The prospect of the war without massive loss of life of our South Korean allies is impossible, and therefore there isn't going to be a war. So Trump's talk of some kind of military solution to the problems, that's just foolish hot air. That's not going to happen. However, the North Koreans watched acutely what happened to Ceausescu, for example, and they also watched what happened to Gaddafi. When Gaddafi was killed, it was reported that the North Korean presidential bodyguard went up by tenfold, from something like 7,000 to 70,000. Kim Jong-un knows that the fact that North Korea has got nuclear bombs means that the West will not attack it. It's his insurance policy. He's not going to give it up. No question in my mind about that. So
what do you think the talks are for then, at least from their side? I can see why people in the West, like Americans or ourselves or Donald Trump, may think this is a good idea, but what are the North Koreans getting out of this?
Well, the North Koreans get. No, I can see what the North Koreans get out of it. I can't see what the West gets out of it. I can't see what the States get out of it. So what the North Koreans get is the fact that Kim Jong-un is sufficiently a tough guy. He's a big tough guy. And look at this. He's got the American president to come to the. I'm guessing it's going to happen in the DMZ or the other places out of Mongolia. They're going to sit down and talk. That is, Kim Jong-un is an actor like Vladimir Putin or Theresa May or Macron in France. He's at the same table. So that's a huge positive for Kim Jong-un and the North Korean dictatorship. And what's the West getting out of it? I mean, yeah, okay, we can talk about, yes, wouldn't it be great if we gave up our nuclear weapons? There is no logic for the North Koreans in doing that. So I suspect that they're lying. This is a lying state, that they're saying, oh, yes, we're happy to talk about surrendering our nuclear weapons. They're not going to do that because they're afraid of regime change. That's their great big fear. That's Kim Jong-un's number one fear. The entire state, the gulag, all of the people locked up, all of that is about preventing regime change. So why give up your nuclear weapons? You can talk about it, but you're not going to do it. So I think it's a piece of political theatre, in particular for people who don't get it. You can't hit North Korea without them being able to hit and kill hundreds of thousands of South Koreans. So that a war is being avoided is Trump's argument. This is, give me the Nobel Peace Prize. Well, stop there. There is no real war, and everybody in the Pentagon and Tillerson at State, they know that. They know that. So it's a piece of political theatre, but really the big beneficiary is Kim Jong-un. He's a big player. He can show this footage back to the North Koreans. Look at us. The Americans have come to us and talked to us as equals. Fantastic positive for the North Koreans. Trump's gone for it because because he's the Barnum and Bailey of American politics. He likes this kind of grand gesture. But what happens quite soon? There'll be another moment of tension, and then it'll be worse. I can't see these two egos getting on. They might be all smiles for the moment, but will anybody be released from the gulag? Will the North Koreans give up their no? Will they give up their nuclear weapons? No. I do not see why this is necessary. The policy of the United States in the past and the other actors has been containment. It's not a great policy because it hasn't changed the essential drive the North Koreans have got to becoming a nuclear armed state. But military action can't work for the reasons I've given. So this meeting and talking, you can do that. It can reduce passions for a bit. But Trump's so undiplomatic. He's so volatile. He's so much the kind of the man who shoots from the hip and asks questions later. I don't think this is. I don't think in the middle of the long term it's a good thing, and I'm sceptical.
Yes. Well, John Sweeney, I've kept you longer than I should here. I apologise. Your book, if anyone wants to read it, I'm sure people do, is North Korea Undercover. There's a documentary with the same title by Panorama, and your website is johnsweeney.co.uk. John Sweeney, thanks for coming on the Korea Now podcast.
Jed, thanks very much. It's a pleasure. And I do hope that one day the people in the Gulag will be able to talk on your podcast too.
Yes, me too. All right, John, thanks a lot.
Take care.